For years, Ellen's public persona was that of a kind-hearted, quirky host who only wanted to make people happy. But behind the velvet curtain of her talk show, insiders began whispering a much darker truth. Staffers described a workplace filled with fear, toxicity, and control. Former employees alleged bullying, racism, and emotional manipulation. The woman who told the world to be kind was now being accused of being anything but. At first, Ellen stayed silent, hoping the rumors would fade. But they didn't. The internet exploded with testimonials. Guests came forward. Even celebrities like Brad Garrett and Leah Thompson hinted that the stories were true. In 2020, the very foundation of her empire began to crumble. Warner Brothers launched an internal investigation. Executive producers were fired, and eventually, Ellen herself addressed the controversy on air with a nervous smile and a wavering apology. But by then, the damage was done. Viewership plummeted. Longtime fans turned away. And the once unstoppable host was now branded as hypocritical and cruel. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of her reputation. It was the deep, personal toll it took on her spirit. In May 2022, after 19 seasons and over 3,000 episodes, the Ellen DeGeneres show came to an end. The final episode aired quietly, with none of the celebration or fanfare that had once defined her career. Ellen said she was ready for a new chapter, but what awaited her was not freedom, it was isolation. Once surrounded by A-listers, press, and cheering fans, Ellen's world suddenly became eerily quiet. She retreated to her home in Montecito, rarely seen in public, often alone or accompanied only by her wife, Portia de Rossi. Sources close to her said she was deeply hurt, not just by the accusations, but by the speed at which the world had turned against her. Friends stopped calling. Opportunities dried up. In interviews, she tried to maintain her usual optimism, but the sadness in her eyes told another story. The woman who once made millions feel less alone was now battling loneliness herself. She had spent decades building a legacy of kindness, only to see it erased in a matter of months. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part, her silence. Ellen, the once outspoken trailblazer, now barely speaks at all. If this story has touched you so far, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more Hollywood deep dives, and leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on Ellen's journey? We'd love to hear from you. At 67, Ellen DeGeneres stands at a crossroads few in Hollywood ever reach. Once the face of courage, hope, and laughter, she now exists in a strange limbo, neither celebrated nor fully forgotten. Some argue that her fall from grace was deserved, that no one, not even Ellen, is above accountability. Others believe she was unfairly villainized, that a few missteps were blown out of proportion in a culture that thrives on takedowns. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. Ellen was never perfect, but she was human. She gave so much, financially, emotionally, publicly, and in the end, received so little grace in return. In private moments, she's reportedly been exploring art, meditation, and animal rescue work. Small attempts to heal. Small steps toward peace. But the laughter that once echoed through her studio is gone. And with it, the sparkle that once made her a global icon. The tragedy of Ellen DeGeneres isn't just about scandal or canceled shows. It's about the brutal reality of public rejection. About a woman who broke boundaries, changed hearts, and paid the ultimate price for her fame. The tragedy is not that Ellen DeGeneres was flawed, but that the world no longer allows space for redemption. Long before the suits, the dancing, and the daytime dominance, Ellen DeGeneres was just a struggling stand-up comic from New Orleans, trying to find her voice in rooms full of people who didn't quite know what to make of her. She was awkward, self-deprecating, clever in a way that made people laugh without making them feel small. But underneath the punchlines was a woman carrying a secret so heavy it nearly broke her. She was gay, and in the late 1980s and early 90s, the truth wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. Ellen's earliest years in entertainment were marked by hustle and rejection, and even when success finally found her with her hit sitcom Ellen, the personal cost of authenticity remained unbearable. In 1997, when she came out publicly, both in real life and through her character, it was a landmark moment in television history. But what followed was a wave of backlash so vicious it nearly destroyed her. Ratings dropped. Sponsors vanished. She was labeled too political, too controversial, and soon found herself blacklisted by the very industry that had once embraced her. In interviews, she admitted to being depressed, unable to work, spiraling emotionally as her career crumbled around her. She had told the truth, and the truth had almost ended everything, but somehow she rebuilt. Years later, she returned, not to sitcoms or scripted drama, but as herself. The Ellen DeGeneres Show wasn't just a comeback. It was a phenomenon. She danced through the pain, laughed through the trauma, reinvented herself as a beacon of kindness, joy, and generosity. Her talk show felt like a warm blanket in a cold world, and for nearly 2 decades, she reigned as one of the most beloved figures in entertainment. But while the public was swept up in the joy, Ellen's own grip on that image was quietly breaking. Because being the nice one isn't a role, it's a performance. And it's a performance that doesn't allow for bad days, private struggles, or even moments of exhaustion. Every smile had to be real. Every laugh had to be natural. And the moment they weren't, the world would start to question everything. Ellen was no longer just a person. She had become a brand. And that brand demanded perfection. Behind the scenes, the cracks in Ellen's empire had been forming for years, but no one dared speak of them, not publicly. Not in the bright light of her carefully curated brand. Former employees whispered about the pressure, about the smiles that had to stay plastered on no matter what, about the fear that crept through the hallways when Ellen wasn't laughing. And then, like a dam breaking, the silence shattered. In 2020, stories began to surface, first anonymously, then with names attached. Allegations of a toxic workplace, bullying, intimidation, racism, and emotional manipulation flooded the headlines. Producers were accused of misconduct, and Ellen herself was suddenly at the center of a storm that seemed to have been waiting in the wings for far too long. What shocked the public even more than the content of the allegations was that they contradicted everything she had built her image on: kindness, safety, joy. It was as if the very foundation of who they believed she was had been yanked out from under them. But behind the scandal was a deeper tragedy. Because while the media turned on her overnight, few asked how a woman who had spent decades fighting just to be accepted had reached such a breaking point. Friends say Ellen withdrew during the storm, devastated, not just by the accusations, but by the betrayal of an image she'd spent years trying to uphold. She apologized, publicly and privately, but the damage was done. The narrative had flipped, and in the eyes of many, her legacy was now stained. And while some called it justice, others quietly wondered how much of the pressure to be perfect contributed to this collapse. How much pain had Ellen been hiding behind that relentless smile? And if you're watching this and beginning to understand the weight that comes with being a symbol rather than a person, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because this isn't just about fame, it's about the cost of being everyone's favorite escape, even when you're the one who needs saving. In the final seasons of her show, the laughter felt quieter, the eyes less bright, the monologues less playful and more careful. You could feel her slipping away, not because she had changed, but because she had nothing left to give. The applause still echoed, but it didn't heal. Her goodbye was dignified, emotional, but underneath the celebration was a woman walking away from a world that had once begged her to be their joy, only to discard her the moment she showed her pain. Ellen's tragedy isn't a fall from grace. It's that grace was always conditional. She was allowed to rise only as long as she never stumbled. After the final episode aired and the set was quietly torn down, Ellen DeGeneres didn't just step away from a talk show. She stepped away from the identity she had worn like armor for nearly 2 decades. The applause faded, the cameras stopped rolling, and suddenly the woman who once danced down studio aisles 5 days a week was nowhere to be seen. There was no comeback special, no pivot to another platform, no reintroduction on social media. She disappeared, not in scandal but in exhaustion. Because the truth is, Ellen wasn't just tired of the criticism. She was tired of pretending she wasn't tired. For years, she had carried the weight of a public that demanded she be kind, funny, charming, and invulnerable. But what happens when the world's expectations become louder than your own voice? For Ellen, that silence became both a refuge and a prison. Those close to her say she retreated to her Montecito home, surrounded by nature, animals, and her wife, Portia de Rossi, hoping the quiet would heal what the noise had damaged. But even in that stillness, there were echoes of grief. Grief for the version of herself she could never return to. Grief for the trust lost with her audience. Grief for the career that once saved her from obscurity, only to later bury her beneath a tidal wave of criticism. The public image of Ellen, the woman who could make you cry with laughter and then cry again with a surprise act of generosity, had become so large, so untouchable, that no one saw the real woman crumbling beneath it. Even years after the show's end, she rarely makes appearances. Her interviews are scarce, measured, and often tinged with a sadness she doesn't try to hide anymore. She speaks of being misunderstood, of being heartbroken that the world forgot how hard she fought to be accepted in the first place. Because long before the scandal, long before the fame, Ellen's journey was one of deep personal sacrifice. She risked everything to come out publicly, when doing so could have ended her career permanently. She clawed her way back from cultural exile and built a space that welcomed everyone, even as she silently struggled with depression, anxiety, and the weight of unresolved childhood trauma. But the world, it seems, is quick to forget the battles someone has fought when the facade starts to crack. For Ellen, there is no stage now, just memory. No spotlight, only reflection. And what she's left with is a question she never thought she'd have to ask again. Was it worth it? Because even after all the lives she touched, the barriers she broke, the years of resilience and joy she offered the world, she remains a woman who, in the end, was allowed to be celebrated only as long as she remained unflawed. The tragedy isn't just that Ellen was taken down. It's that she was never truly allowed to be real. Now, in the quiet shadow of her once unshakable fame, Ellen DeGeneres lives not in the glare of studio lights, but in the kind of stillness that once felt impossible. She doesn't rush to reclaim her spot on television. There are no major comeback plans, no streaming deals, no memoir rushed to shelves to repair a legacy. And maybe that's because Ellen understands something now that few in her position ever do. Sometimes the greatest form of strength is stepping away. But in that retreat, the silence speaks louder than ever. What lingers is not the scandal, not the headlines or the speculation. It's the ache of a woman who gave so much of herself to the world, only to realize that the version of her people adored was never fully her to begin with. For 2 decades, she signed off every show with the same message: be kind to one another. And now, in her absence, we're left to wonder if that kindness was ever truly returned to her. Ellen wasn't just a comedian or a talk show host. She was a cultural pillar. She gave millions permission to laugh, to feel, to dance in their living rooms during times when the world felt unkind and unrecognizable. But behind the legacy lies a quieter truth, that the love she gave so freely was often conditional in return. Fans cheered her on when she brought joy, but abandoned her when she revealed pain. Her legacy, now complicated, lives in contradiction. She is both a pioneer and a pariah, a woman who broke barriers and a woman brought down by the very system that once praised her. But what most people still fail to see is the loneliness in that contradiction. The Ellen we remember wasn't just a performer. She was someone who spent her life trying to prove she was enough. Enough to be seen, enough to be loved, enough to be forgiven. And in the silence that follows a life lived so publicly, the heartbreak is this: that a woman who gave joy to the world now walks her path in near invisibility. Not because she was unworthy, but because the world turned cold the moment she stopped smiling. There's no encore, no standing ovation, just the echo of laughter that once filled a studio, now replaced by the sound of someone trying to heal out of view. That is the tragedy, not in what she did, but in what she carried. Ellen DeGeneres was never the perfect host or the flawless icon. She was human, and she spent decades trying to prove that being human was enough. Maybe now, in the quiet, she'll finally believe it herself. And maybe, just maybe, the rest of the world will too.